"You don't belong at this table." He said it without lowering his voice, without leaning in, without any of the small courtesies that might have softened the blow. He said it the way a man says something he has believed for a long time and finally found occasion to speak aloud, with the ease of certainty, with the satisfaction of a door being closed. The dining room of the Whitmore estate was long and formal, lit by a chandelier whose light fell in warm pools across the mahogany table, across the crystal stemware, across the faces of the men seated around it. There were 6 of them. Sons, lawyers, a family accountant named Gerald Fitch, who had worked for the Whitmore family for 22 years, and who now studied the grain of the tablecloth as though it contained a message meant only for him. None of them spoke. None of them moved to intervene. The room held its breath and did nothing with it. The man who had spoken was Randall Whitmore III. He sat at the right hand of his father's empty chair and spoke as though that proximity conferred authority. His eyes were fixed on the young man seated at the far end of the table, the quiet one, the still one, the one who had not yet said a word. Marcus. What Randall did not know, what none of them knew, not yet, was that the answer Marcus was about to give would cost Randall everything he had spent his entire life assuming was already his. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. When the truth came out, it did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived the way Marcus himself had always moved through the world, quietly, precisely, and with the full weight of something that had been building for a very long time. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Marcus really was, long before he ever sat down at that table. Now, here's what most people did not know about Marcus Elliott Whitmore. They did not know the name he carried before the adoption. They did not know the apartment on the south side of Columbus, Ohio, where he had spent the first 7 years of his life. 3 rooms, a radiator that knocked through the winter nights, a window looking out onto an alley where his grandmother, Delia, hung laundry on a line strung between 2 iron poles. They did not know Delia at all, and that was their loss, because Delia was the architecture of everything Marcus became. She was a small woman who had survived 3 decades of work in other people's houses and had never once mistaken the size of a room for the size of a life. She cooked on Sundays and kept her Bible on the kitchen table and told Marcus, when he was 5 years old and already watching the world with those careful, measuring eyes, "Stay low, build high. Let them think you're nothing. Let them keep thinking it. Then one day they'll look up and realize they've been standing in your shadow the whole time." He had not forgotten a syllable of it. Marcus came to the Whitmore family at age 8, through a state foster program, placed with Edward Whitmore, the patriarch, the millionaire, the man who had built a regional logistics empire from a single warehouse in Dayton, and his then-wife Catherine, who had wanted a child and whose health had made biological parenthood impossible. The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday in March. Marcus remembered the courtroom. He remembered the smell of old paper and floor wax. He remembered Edward Whitmore shaking the judge's hand and then turning to look at him, not with pity, not with performance, but with something quieter than either. Recognition, maybe, the same kind he had seen in his grandmother's eyes. Edward was not a warm man in the conventional sense. He did not ruffle hair or offer easy praise, but he was a fair man, and in Marcus's experience, fair was rarer and more valuable than warm. He set expectations clearly. He rewarded effort without ceremony, and he watched, the way Marcus watched, with the patience of someone who understood that character reveals itself slowly, through the accumulation of small decisions. Marcus grew up in the Whitmore house on Fenwick Drive, in a suburb north of Columbus where the lawns were wide and the neighbors were not always sure what to make of him. He attended the same schools as Randall and Randall's younger brother, Philip. He ate at the same table. He wore the same school uniform, and he was never, not once, made to feel by Edward that he was less than a son. By Edward. The brothers were another matter. But Marcus did not spend his energy on that. He spent it on the books Edward kept in the study. Business histories, biographies of industrialists, case studies in logistics and supply chain management that most boys his age would have found impenetrable. He read them the way his grandmother had taught him to read everything, slowly, twice, with a pencil in hand. He spent it on the summer internships Edward arranged, starting at age 15 in the warehouse operations of Whitmore Logistics. Not in the executive suite, not in the glass-walled conference rooms, but on the floor, among the dock workers and freight coordinators and route planners who kept the whole machine moving. He learned the smell of a working warehouse, diesel, exhaust, and cardboard and the particular metallic tang of a loading dock in July. He learned what it cost in human hours to move a single pallet from point A to point B. He learned the difference between a company that looked profitable and one that actually was. He moved in silence. He built in silence. By the time Marcus was 24, he held a degree in operations management from Ohio State and a second degree, earned at night over 3 years, in finance. He had worked in 3 different divisions of Whitmore Logistics, always at the level below where his knowledge would have placed him, always watching, always learning the gap between what the reports said and what the floors showed. He had written, on a single yellow legal pad he kept in the drawer of his desk at home, a 40-page analysis of the company's structural inefficiencies, routes that bled money, contracts that had outlived their value, a distribution hub in Cincinnati that was costing the company 4 times what it produced. He had shown that analysis to no one. He had simply waited. Now, here is what the Whitmore brothers knew about Marcus, or thought they knew. They knew he was adopted. They knew he was black. They knew he had grown up in foster care before Edward brought him home, which, in their private accounting, meant he had arrived with nothing and been given everything. A debt, in their estimation, that could never quite be repaid. Randall had been 22 when Marcus joined the family, already away at college, already forming the opinions he would carry for the rest of his life. He had returned home for holidays and treated Marcus with the particular brand of courtesy that is indistinguishable, to the careful observer, from contempt, polite, distant, correct, the kind of correct that leaves no fingerprints. Philip was softer, younger, less certain of himself, and therefore more dangerous in a different way. He followed Randall's lead without always knowing he was doing it. What neither of them had ever done was take Marcus seriously. Not as a businessman, not as a son, not as a man who had spent 15 years learning, from the inside, exactly how their father's empire ran. That was their mistake. And it was about to matter. Edward Whitmore had turned 73 in October. The celebration had been small. A dinner at the house on Fenwick Drive, a cake that Catherine would have loved, a bottle of Bordeaux from a case Edward had been saving for 20 years. He had sat at the head of his table and looked at his 3 sons and said very little, because Edward had never needed many words to say a great deal. But those who knew him well, Gerald Fitch for one, could see something in the patriarch's expression that night. A settling, A man who has been carrying something for a long time and is deciding, at last, where to set it down. 3 weeks after that dinner, Edward called a meeting. He sent the same message to all 3 sons through Gerald. Come to the house on Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, the formal dining room, no agenda, no explanation, just the time, the place, and the expectation that they would be there. Randall arrived first at 9:40 in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, with the particular energy of a man who has already decided how a meeting will end. He poured himself coffee from the sideboard and stood near the window and looked out at the grounds with the proprietary ease of a man surveying what he considers his own. He was 51 years old, the eldest, and he had spent the better part of 3 decades operating on the assumption that primogeniture, though not legally binding, carried a moral weight that would ultimately be honored. Philip arrived at 9:55, quieter, a little pale, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. He sat down and looked at the table and did not look at Randall. Marcus arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. He wore a dark gray sweater and carried nothing. He sat at the far end of the table, folded his hands in front of him, and waited. Edward came in at 10 past the hour. He moved more slowly than he used to, but his eyes were the same, sharp, level, unhurried. He sat at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn, and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a person with genuine authority enters them. He said, "I'm going to ask you one question. One. I want you to think before you answer. Take all the time you need." He paused. "What is Whitmore Logistics worth?" Randall did not take all the time he needed. He answered the way a man answers when he believes the question is a formality, briskly, with numbers, with the name of an investment bank that had produced a valuation report 18 months prior. He cited figures, he cited market comparables, he cited revenue trajectory and asset base and the brand equity that 4 decades of operation had produced. It was a thorough answer. It was the answer of a man who had read the reports and trusted them completely. Philip's answer was shorter and more honest in its uncertainty. He named a number somewhat lower than Randall's, acknowledged he was not the financial expert in the room, and deferred with visible discomfort to what the professionals had said. Edward listened to both without expression. Then he looked at the far end of the table. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, the quiet of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. Then he said, "The question isn't what it's worth. The question is what it's worth to whom and under what conditions." Randall's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. Marcus continued. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Randall. He looked at his father, at Edward, and spoke with the measured precision of a man who had been rehearsing this, not in front of a mirror, but in the actual rooms and loading docks and spreadsheets of the company itself. He said the Cincinnati hub was running at a loss that the current reporting structure obscured. He said the 3 largest contracts by revenue were also the 3 most operationally fragile, because they were single vendor dependencies with no redundancy built in. He said the company's real value, its defensible value, was in its mid-tier regional relationships, the ones no one talked about in the boardroom because they weren't glamorous, and that those relationships were being systematically underinvested while capital chased the headline accounts. He named figures. He named dates. He named specific contracts and specific routes and specific margin differentials that no one in that room except Edward had ever looked at that closely. The room was very still. Gerald Fitch, seated against the wall with his notepad open and his pen uncapped, had stopped writing. He was simply listening, and on his face, for the first time in a very long while, was something that might have been described as relief. Edward looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then he looked at Gerald. Then he looked back at his eldest son, whose face had gone through several colors in the space of about 90 seconds. He said, "That's the right answer." 4 words, spoken quietly, without drama. But in that room, at that table, they landed like a verdict. Randall set down his coffee cup. The sound of it, ceramic on mahogany, harder than he intended, was the only sound in the room for a long moment. "Dad," he said, "you can't be serious." Edward looked at him with the patience of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. "I'm always serious," he said. "You know that." What happened next would take several more hours to fully unfold, but the shape of it was already visible in the way Gerald quietly closed his notepad, in the way Philip looked at Marcus with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something older, something that looked, if you watched carefully, like recognition. Like a man realizing he had been looking at something for years without ever actually seeing it. And Randall pushed back from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, and the line of his shoulders said everything he would not let his voice say. He had spent 30 years in the shadow of an assumption. He had simply never known whose shadow it was, and it was about to get worse. Now, here is what most people did not know about the weeks that followed that Saturday morning. They did not know about the conversation Edward had with Gerald Fitch the following Monday, in the small office off the main study where Edward kept the documents that mattered most. The ones in the fireproof cabinet, the ones with the original signatures, the ones Gerald had been updating quietly and carefully for the better part of 2 years. They did not know that Edward had been watching his 3 sons not just at that table, not just in that single hour, but across years of small moments, a decision made under pressure, a response to failure, a question asked or not asked, a kindness extended or withheld when no one was looking. He had understood, long before that Saturday morning, exactly what he intended to do. He had simply been waiting for the question to prove him right. The answer Marcus gave was not a surprise to Edward. It was a confirmation. Edward had built his company on the principle that the most dangerous thing a business could do was confuse the appearance of value with value itself. He had learned it the hard way in the early years, when a partnership that looked brilliant on paper had nearly taken everything from him. He had tried, in his careful and understated way, to pass that lesson on to all 3 sons. 2 of them had learned to recite it. 1 of them had learned to live it. The documents Gerald produced that Monday were thorough and unambiguous. A restructured succession plan, drawn up over 22 months, reviewed by 3 independent attorneys, signed and notarized and filed with the appropriate county office in October, the same month Edward had turned 73. The plan named Marcus as the primary operational successor to Whitmore Logistics, with a defined transition period of 18 months and a governance structure that included a 3-person advisory board, of which Randall and Philip were each offered a seat if they chose to take it. If. Randall did not take it quietly. He retained an attorney within 48 hours, a litigator named Hargrove who specialized in contested estate and succession disputes. He called Gerald Fitch twice in the first week, each call longer and louder than the last. He called Philip, who listened and said very little, and then, in a conversation that lasted 11 minutes, told his brother he had decided not to contest the plan. Philip's voice, by all accounts, was steady when he said it. Randall filed a formal challenge in the fourth week. The grounds were what you might expect: questions of undue influence, of competency, of whether a man of Edward's age and health had been manipulated into a decision that did not reflect his true wishes. It was the kind of challenge that sounds substantial until you place it next to 22 months of documented preparation, 3 independent legal reviews, and a man who had spent 40 years building an empire and who was, by every measurable standard, in full possession of his faculties. The challenge was dismissed in 61 days. Gerald Fitch testified. He was precise and unhurried, and spoke in the same measured cadence he used in every boardroom and conference call where numbers had to be made clear to people who did not want to hear them. He described the timeline of the succession plan. He described the conversations he had witnessed between Edward and Marcus over the preceding 2 years. Not conversations about inheritance, but conversations about operations, about strategy, about the specific structural problems Marcus had identified and the solutions he had quietly developed. He described the 40-page analysis on the yellow legal pad, which Edward had read in full and which Gerald had since had copied and filed. The judge asked no follow-up questions after Gerald's testimony. She had heard enough. The challenge was dismissed. The succession plan stood, and Randall Whitmore III, who had walked into that dining room on a Saturday morning in November with the certainty of a man who has never seriously imagined being told no, walked out of a courthouse 61 days later with nothing he had not already possessed before he filed, which was to say, a seat on an advisory board he had declined and a share of a company he no longer controlled. He did not take the advisory seat. He never returned to the house on Fenwick Drive. The company, under Marcus's operational leadership, addressed the Cincinnati hub in the first quarter. The restructuring took 4 months and recovered margins that had been bleeding quietly for 6 years. The 3 fragile headline contracts were renegotiated, 2 successfully, 1 allowed to expire, a decision that cost revenue in the short term and strengthened the company's position in ways the original contract never could have. The mid-tier regional relationships Marcus had named in that dining room received capital investment for the first time in a decade. Gerald Fitch stayed on through the transition, 3 months longer than he had intended, because there were things he wanted to see through. On his last day, Edward gave him a bottle of Bordeaux from the same case as the birthday dinner. Gerald took it home and did not open it for a year. When he finally did, he said later, it tasted exactly right. Philip called Marcus 6 weeks after the court ruling. The call lasted 23 minutes. Neither man described it in detail to anyone else afterward, but Philip accepted the advisory board seat the following month. He showed up to the first meeting with a notepad and a list of questions and none of his brother's certainty, and Marcus, who had spent his entire life learning how to make use of what was actually in front of him rather than what he wished were there, found that he could work with that. It was not a warm reunion, but it was honest. And in Marcus's experience, honest was rarer and more valuable than warm. Edward Whitmore watched all of it from the house on Fenwick Drive. On a Sunday in February, when Marcus came for dinner and they sat together in the study after the meal, Edward looked at his son, and said 4 words that Marcus would carry for the rest of his life. "Your grandmother would know." Marcus looked at the fire for a long moment. He thought about a woman who had hung laundry in an alley on the south side of Columbus and who had told a 5-year-old boy to stay low and build high. He thought about what she would have made of this room, this house, this life. He thought she would have looked at it the way she looked at everything, steadily, without sentimentality, with the clear eyes of someone who understood that a life is not measured by what it looks like from the outside. He said nothing. He did not need to. The fire settled. The room was quiet. Now, here's what most people did not know about the morning Marcus first arrived at the Cincinnati hub as its incoming operational head. He did not come in a suit. He did not come with an entourage. He drove himself in a car that was 7 years old, parked in the employee lot, and walked through the loading dock entrance. He stood on the floor for 45 minutes before anyone realized who he was. He watched the rhythm of the place, the way freight moved or failed to move, the small hesitations and workarounds that workers develop when a system is broken, but no one above them has ever bothered to ask. He carried a single yellow legal pad and a pen, and he wrote in the same small, precise hand he had used since he was 15 years old, standing on the same kind of floor, learning what a company actually was beneath the surface of what it claimed to be. A floor supervisor named Darnell Okafor noticed him first. Darnell had been with the Cincinnati hub for 11 years, had applied for a management position twice, and been passed over both times for candidates brought in from outside, and had developed the particular alertness of a man who has learned to read a room before the room reads him. He watched the quiet stranger with the legal pad for 20 minutes. Then he walked over. "You're not an auditor," Darnell said. It was not a question. Marcus looked at him. "No," he said, "I'm not." "You know what's wrong with this place?" Darnell said. Still not a question. "I have some ideas," Marcus said. "I'd like to hear yours first." Darnell looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that measures a person not by what they carry or how they dress, but by something harder to name and harder to fake. Then he nodded once and said, "Give me 10 minutes to hand off the next truck." What Darnell told him in the following hour was not different from what Marcus had written in the 40-page analysis, but it was richer. It was the difference between a map and the actual terrain, the live-eat texture of a system failing the people inside it, described by a man who had been inside it for 11 years and had never once been asked. Darnell named the specific foreman whose scheduling decisions created cascading delays 3 shifts down the line. He named the vendor whose delivery windows were consistently misrepresented and whose contract renewal had been pushed through over the objections of every floor supervisor in the building. He named the informal workarounds the dock workers had invented to compensate for routing software that had not been updated in 4 years and that no one in the executive suite had apparently noticed was obsolete. Marcus wrote all of it down. He asked questions. He listened without interrupting. He stayed until the afternoon shift change, shook Darnell's hand, and drove back to Columbus. 3 weeks later, Darnell Okafor received a letter offering him the position of Regional Operations Director for the Cincinnati hub. The salary was 40% higher than his current rate. The letter was signed by Marcus. There was no cover note, no explanation, no performance of magnanimity, just the offer, the terms, and a line at the bottom that said the position was his if he wanted it. Darnell called his wife that night and read her the letter twice. She told him to sleep on it. He told her he had already decided. He accepted the following morning. This was how Marcus built things. Not with announcements, not with the language of transformation that fills press releases and investor calls. With the patient, deliberate identification of what was actually broken and the equally patient identification of who actually understood it. He had learned this from Edward, and Edward had learned it the hard way, and the lesson had passed between them not in speeches but in years of watching each other work. Marcus had never forgotten that the most important knowledge in any organization lives closest to the floor. The restructuring of the Cincinnati hub took 4 months, but those 4 months were built on 11 years of Darnell Okafor's knowledge. That was the part that never made it into the quarterly report. That was the part that mattered most. Now, here's what most people did not know about the consortium. 6 months into Marcus's tenure, a group of regional freight and distribution companies began circulating a proposal. The consortium, 5 companies, collectively representing a significant share of the Midwest's mid-tier logistics market, was exploring a merger structure that would create a unified regional network capable of competing with the national carriers that had been systematically absorbing smaller operators for the better part of a decade. Whitmore Logistics was the largest of the 5, which meant Marcus was the most important person in the room before he had ever walked into it. The man who had convened the consortium was named Harlan Breckett. He was 64 years old, the founder and chief executive of Breckett Freight Solutions, a company he had built from a single truck and a borrowed phone line in 1987 into a regional operation with 240 employees and a reputation for reliability he wore like a second skin. He was not a cruel man. He was not prejudiced in the way Randall Whitmore had been prejudiced, with the casual inherited certainty of someone who had never needed to examine his assumptions because they had always been confirmed. But Harlan Breckett was a man who trusted what he could see, and what he saw when Marcus walked into the first consortium meeting in a conference room at a hotel in Indianapolis was not what he had expected. He had expected Edward, or someone like Edward, someone whose age and bearing matched the weight of what Whitmore Logistics represented. He had spoken with Edward twice by phone in the preceding month, because the succession had not yet been widely publicized and because Harlan, who did his research through relationships rather than press releases, had not yet updated his understanding of who was now running the company. What he saw was a 32-year-old man in a dark gray sweater who sat down at the table, placed a single folder in front of him, and said nothing until everyone else had settled. Harlan looked at the man across the table. Then he looked at the woman seated to Marcus's left, a contracts attorney named Vivian Park, who had joined Whitmore Logistics 6 weeks earlier from a firm in Cleveland, and who had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who has read every document in the room before anyone else arrived. Then Harlan looked back at Marcus. "Where's Edward?" he said. Not unkindly, but directly. "Edward is at home," Marcus said. "I'm his son. I run the company." The room shifted. Not dramatically, not with any single gesture that could be pointed to afterward. But the shift was there, a recalibration, a reassessment, the particular social friction of a room full of people adjusting their expectations without being willing to say so aloud. 2 of the other consortium representatives exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second. One of them, a man named Cresswell who ran a freight operation out of Fort Wayne, cleared his throat and looked at his phone. Harlan Breckett said, "I see." He said it the way a man says something when he is buying himself time to decide what he actually thinks. Marcus opened his folder. He did not acknowledge the shift in the room. He had spent his entire life in rooms that shifted when he entered them, and he had learned, in the way that Delia had taught him to learn things, that the shift itself was information. About the room, not about him. He said, "I've reviewed the proposed merger structure. I have concerns about the equity allocation model, and I think there's a structural problem in the governance framework that will create friction at the operational level within 18 months of close. I'd like to walk through both." Silence. a different kind than before. Then Vivian Park opened her own folder, and the meeting began. What followed over the next 2 hours was not what Harlan Breckett had planned. He had planned a preliminary session, a getting to know you, a broad strokes alignment on vision. What he got instead was a precise methodical dissection of the merger proposal by a man who had clearly read every page of it and who had identified, with the specificity of someone who had actually operated inside a logistics network rather than merely managed one from above, the exact points at which the structure would fail. The equity allocation model assumed uniform operational efficiency across all 5 companies. Marcus showed, with figures drawn from the consortium's own submitted data, that the variance between the highest and lowest performers was large enough to make uniform allocation not just unfair, but structurally destabilizing. It would create incentive misalignments that would surface within the first fiscal year and be nearly impossible to unwind without renegotiating the entire agreement. The governance framework proposed a rotating chairmanship among the 5 founding companies. Marcus said this was the wrong structure for a network that needed fast operational decisions, and that a rotating chair in a 5-party consortium was not governance. It was delay with the title attached. He proposed an alternative: a permanent operations board with defined decision rights, a clear escalation path, and a sunset clause triggering a full governance review at the 3-year mark. He spoke for 40 minutes total. He used no slides. He referenced the folder twice. He answered every question from around the table, including 2 from Cresswell that were less questions than tests, the kind of challenge a man issues when he is not yet willing to accept that the person across from him knows more than he does. Marcus answered both with the same measured precision he brought to everything. He did not perform patience. He simply had it. Harlan Breckett said very little during those 40 minutes. He listened. He had spent 40 years in freight and distribution, and he knew the difference between a man who had studied a business and a man who had lived inside one. He knew it the way you know the difference between a weather report and standing in the rain. When Marcus finished, Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You wrote this analysis yourself?" "Yes," Marcus said. "When?" "Over the last 3 weeks," Marcus said. "Evenings mostly." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen, uncapped it, and drew a single line through the agenda he had prepared for the meeting. "Let's start over," he said, "with your framework." Cresswell looked up from his phone. The other representatives straightened in their chairs. Vivian Park made a small note in the margin of her folder and did not look up, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that might, in a different register, have been called a smile. It was not the end of the negotiation. There were 7 more meetings, 3 rounds of revised documentation, 2 separate legal reviews, and 1 week in which the entire consortium structure nearly collapsed over a single clause in the indemnification agreement that Vivian Park had flagged in the second session, and that no one else had thought to address until it became a crisis. Marcus spent that week on the phone with each of the 4 other consortium representatives in sequence, not to pressure them, but to walk through the clause's implications with the same patient precision he brought to everything, and to propose a modification that protected all parties without reopening the equity structure. The clause was resolved. The consortium agreement was signed 8 weeks after that first meeting in Indianapolis. Harlan Breckett called Marcus the morning after the signing. The call lasted 6 minutes. Harlan said 3 things: that he had been wrong in his initial assessment, that the governance framework Marcus had proposed was already proving its value, and that he hoped they would work together for a long time. Marcus thanked him. He meant it. He did not say anything about the shift in the room on that first day. He did not mention the exchanged glance or Cresswell's tests or the quality of the silence that had greeted his introduction. He had not forgotten any of it. He simply had no use for it now. The consortium, once operational, restructured the mid-tier regional freight market in ways that took the national carriers 2 years to fully recognize and another year to respond to. By the time they did, the network was too integrated and too efficient to be easily displaced. Darnell Okafor's Cincinnati hub became one of the consortium's 3 primary distribution nodes. The routing software was updated. The vendor, whose contract had been pushed through over the objections of every floor supervisor in the building, was not renewed. These things did not happen because Marcus was angry. They did not happen because he wanted to prove something to the men who had shifted in their chairs or looked at their phones. They happened because Marcus had identified what was broken and done the work to fix it, in the same way he had always done everything. Quietly, precisely, and with the full weight of someone who had been building toward this for a very long time. Delia had told him to stay low and build high. He had never stopped. The reckoning for Randall Whitmore III did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived the way structural failures always arrive. Not as a sudden collapse, but as the accumulated consequence of every assumption that had never been tested, every foundation mistaken for bedrock because no one had ever thought to press on it. The consortium agreement had been public for 3 weeks when a regional business journal published a profile of the new unified network. The reporter had done her work carefully. She had spoken to freight operators, to former Whitmore Logistics employees, to 2 of the other consortium founders. She had obtained, through the county filing system, the succession documents that had been a matter of public record since October. She had spoken, briefly and on background, to Darnell Okafor, who said only that the new leadership understood what was actually happening on the floor, and that in 11 years he had never been asked a question that mattered until now. The profile ran 4,000 words. It named Marcus. It described the 40-page analysis, the Cincinnati restructuring, the consortium governance framework, and the specific structural problems Marcus had identified and the outcomes his modifications had produced. It also, in 2 paragraphs near the end, described the succession challenge. It named Randall. It described the grounds of the challenge and the 61-day dismissal and the advisory board seat that had been offered and declined. It did not editorialize. It did not need to. Randall had been, in the months since the court ruling, attempting to position himself as a logistics consultant, trading on the Whitmore name, on his 30 years of adjacency to an empire he had never actually operated, on the assumption that the market would not look too closely at the distinction between proximity and competence. He had secured 2 clients. He had been in conversation with a third, a mid-sized distribution company in Cleveland whose principals had not yet read the profile. They read it on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the conversation had ended. The second client, a warehouse in operation in Akron, called the following Monday. The call lasted 4 minutes. They were, the principal said, going in a different direction. The first client said nothing at all. They simply stopped returning calls. This was not a firing. It was not a lawsuit. It was quieter than that, and in its quietness, it was more complete. It was the market doing what markets do when information becomes available. Recalibrating, withdrawing what had been extended on the basis of an assumption that no longer held. Randall had built his professional identity on a name and a proximity, and when the profile made plain what that name now meant, what it was actually attached to, and who had actually built what it represented, the identity did not survive the contact. He called his attorney, Hargrove, who told him there was nothing actionable in the profile and charged him for the consultation. That was the end of it. Not with a verdict, not with a scene, with the simple, terminal withdrawal of a world that had finally looked at what it was actually dealing with. Darnell Okafor's promotion was announced internally the same week the profile ran. He received, along with the title and the salary, a budget for the operational improvements he had been documenting in his own notebooks for 11 years. The routing updates, the scheduling reforms, the vendor renegotiations he had flagged to managers who had not listened and who were no longer in their positions. He spent the first month of his directorship walking the floor with the same attention Marcus had brought on that first morning, asking the same kinds of questions, writing in a notebook he had bought specifically for the purpose. He did not do this because Marcus had told him to. He did it because he had spent 11 years being the person who was never asked, and he understood, with the full weight of that experience, what it meant to finally be the one doing the asking. His wife framed the offer letter. It hung in the hallway of their house in Cincinnati, next to a photograph of their daughter's first birthday. Darnell walked past it every morning on his way out the door. Vivian Park was made general counsel of Whitmore Logistics 8 months after the consortium agreement closed. She had identified, in the indemnification clause that had nearly collapsed the consortium, a structural vulnerability that no one else in 3 rounds of legal review had caught. She had flagged it in the second meeting in a single sentence in the margin of her folder. That sentence had saved the consortium. Marcus had not forgotten it. He did not forget things that mattered. Edward Whitmore read the profile on a Friday morning in the study on Fenwick Drive, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was reading. He set the paper down when he finished and sat for a long time in the chair he had sat in for 40 years, looking at the room around him, the bookshelves, the fireproof cabinet, the 2 chairs by the window where he and Marcus had sat on a Sunday in February and said almost nothing and meant everything. He did not call anyone. He had known for a long time how this would end. He had simply waited for the world to catch up. Philip called Marcus the day the profile ran. The call lasted 9 minutes. He said, among other things, that he was glad he had taken the advisory seat. He said it without qualification, without the hedging that had characterized most of their early conversations, and Marcus, who had learned to measure sincerity by what a person was willing to say without an audience, believed him. Now, here is what most people did not know about Marcus in the months that followed. He went back to Columbus, not to the house on Fenwick Drive, though he visited there on Sundays. He went to the south side, to the street where the apartment had been. 3 rooms, a radiator, a window looking out onto an alley. The building was still there, different now. A different family's laundry on a different line strung between the same iron poles, or poles that looked like the same ones, which in the arithmetic of memory amounted to the same thing. He stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes in the early morning quiet, in a dark gray sweater, with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the window that had been his grandmother's kitchen window, and he thought about a woman who had survived 3 decades of work in other people's houses and had never once mistaken the size of a room for the size of a life. Stay low, build high. He had done that. He had done exactly that. For 24 years, in the silence and the patience and the accumulated precision of a man who had understood since he was 5 years old that worth is not declared. It is built. It is demonstrated. It is proven when the moment comes in the plain, unadorned language of someone who has done the work and knows exactly what it means. He stood there for a while. Then he walked back to his car and drove to the office. The work was not finished. It was never finished. That was the other thing Delia had understood, and that Marcus had learned from watching her, that the building does not stop when the recognition comes. The recognition is not the point. The building is the point. The discipline, the patience, the refusal to let someone else's assessment of your worth become the ceiling of what you attempt. And this is where I want to speak to you directly, because this story is not only Marcus's story, it is a story that plays out every day in dining rooms and conference rooms and loading docks and hiring offices and classrooms and courtrooms. Wherever a person who has built something real and invisible walks into a room and is met by the settled certainty of someone who has already decided what they are worth. It happens to people who are never profiled in a business journal. It happens to people whose 40-page analyses are never read, whose 11 years of knowledge are never asked for, whose correct answers are never given the room they deserve. It happens quietly, and it costs quietly, in ways that compound across a lifetime. What Marcus's story asks us to consider is not whether the world will eventually recognize what a person has built. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the moment comes, the question is asked, the answer is given, and the room goes still in the way rooms go still when they have heard something true. But the story is not really about the recognition. It is about the building. It is about the discipline of a woman who hung laundry in an alley and told a 5-year-old boy that the shadow he cast would one day be larger than the room could hold. It is about what a person does with that instruction across 24 years of silence, of patience, of work done in the places where no one is watching. The world is full of people who have been standing in someone else's shadow without knowing whose it was. The question is not whether they will eventually look up. The question is what you are building while they are not looking. If you have ever carried something real that the room refused to see, drop a word in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. Every week, we find the people the world overlooked and tell their stories. Subscribe, and we will keep finding them.